After finding out I was pregnant, I discovered my husband's car parked outside his ex-girlfriend's house at midnight. What I heard through her living room window shattered 8 years of marriage and revealed a betrayal deeper than I ever imagined. By morning, he found divorce papers where he expected to find celebration.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
The drugstore pregnancy test felt heavier than it should have in my trembling hands. 2 pink lines, clear as daylight, undeniable as gravity. After 3 years of trying, countless negative tests, and 2 heartbreaking miscarriages, I was finally pregnant again. The joy hit me like a tidal wave, followed immediately by terror. Would this one survive? Could I handle losing another baby? Marcus was working late again, his 3rd evening this month at the architecture firm. The same firm where his ex-girlfriend, Sarah, now worked as the new project coordinator. The same Sarah who'd broken up with him 6 years ago to find herself in Portland, only to return last spring with a promotion and a convenient reassignment to his department. I'd tried to push down the uneasiness I felt about their renewed professional relationship. Marcus had been nothing but transparent, mentioning Sarah's return casually over dinner, explaining how they'd been assigned to the Morrison Hotel project together. "It's ancient history, babe," he'd said, not looking up from his grilled chicken. "We're different people now. Besides, you know you're the only one I want to come home to." But tonight felt different. Tonight, I had news that would change everything. News that would make us a family of 3 instead of 2. I couldn't wait until he got home at his usual 11:30. This moment was too big, too important to sit on alone. The nursery we'd painted hopefully 2 years ago still sat empty down the hall, pale yellow walls now mocking reminders of dreams deferred. Marcus had wanted to convert it into a home office after the second miscarriage, but I couldn't bear to watch him pack away the crib we'd assembled with such optimism. "Not yet," I'd whispered, and he'd understood, leaving the room as our unspoken monument to what might still be. I grabbed my keys and purse, energy buzzing through my veins like caffeine. The pregnancy test went into my jacket pocket, protected in its little plastic case like precious cargo. I'd drive to his office, surprise him with takeout from Romano's, his favorite Italian place, and share our miracle news somewhere more romantic than our kitchen counter. The October night was crisp, full of the promise of changing seasons and new beginnings. I rolled down the window slightly, letting the cool air fill my lungs as I drove through our suburban neighborhood. The houses glowed warmly from within, families settling into evening routines. Soon, that would be us, with a baby, a real, living baby who would fill that yellow room with laughter and love. Downtown Portland's architecture district was quieter than usual for a Thursday night. Most of the trendy restaurants had emptied out, leaving only the dedicated workaholics burning the midnight oil in their glass tower offices. I pulled into the visitor parking at Hartwell & Associates, expecting to see Marcus's black Honda Accord in his usual spot. It wasn't there. I sat in my car for a moment, confusion replacing excitement. Maybe he'd parked in a different spot. Maybe he'd gone to grab dinner and would be back soon. I called his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. "Hey, it's me," I said after the beep, trying to keep my voice light. "I'm at your office with a surprise, but your car's not here. Call me back?" I waited 15 minutes, checking my phone obsessively, watching the building's lit windows for any sign of movement. The cleaning crew made their rounds, but I didn't see Marcus's familiar silhouette anywhere. By 9:45, I was driving home, the takeout containers growing cold in my passenger seat, pregnancy test burning a hole in my pocket. That's when I saw it. His Honda Accord parked 3 blocks from our house on Maple Street, in front of 1247 Maple Street, to be exact. Sarah's address, which I knew because I'd Googled her when Marcus first mentioned her return. I'd told myself it was just curiosity, just wanting to put a current face to the name that had occasionally surfaced in Marcus's college stories. My hands went numb on the steering wheel. There had to be an explanation. Maybe they'd carpooled to a work dinner. Maybe Sarah's car was in the shop. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent reason why my husband's car was parked outside his ex-girlfriend's house at 10 p.m. on the same night I discovered I was carrying his child. I parked half a block away, my heart hammering against my ribs. The street was lined with modest craftsman-style homes, most with front porches and well-maintained gardens. Sarah's house was painted sage green with white trim, a wind chime hanging from her porch ceiling that caught the streetlight as it swayed. Warm light glowed from her living room window. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, arguing with myself. This was crazy. This was paranoid. This was not the behavior of a trusting wife. But I couldn't make myself drive away. Something deep in my gut, some primitive instinct that had nothing to do with logic, kept me frozen in place. The pregnancy test case crinkled in my pocket as I shifted in my seat. In a few hours, this would all make sense. Marcus would come home with a reasonable explanation, and I'd feel foolish for my suspicion. We'd laugh about my pregnancy hormones making me paranoid. We'd stay up late, planning our future, our family, our transformed life. But first, I needed to know why his car was here. I needed to see his face when he told me where he'd been tonight. I needed to look in his eyes and know, with absolute certainty, that the man I was about to make a father was the same man I'd married 8 years ago. The wind chime continued its soft melody as I stepped out of my car and walked toward the house that would either ease my fears or destroy my marriage. The sidewalk felt unsteady beneath my feet as I approached Sarah's house, each step echoing louder than it should in the quiet neighborhood. The October air carried the scent of burning leaves and someone's late dinner cooking, normal smells of suburban life that felt surreal given the churning in my stomach. Marcus's Honda sat under a street lamp like evidence at a crime scene. I touched the hood as I passed, still warm. He'd been here for a while, long enough for the engine to cool, but not long enough for the metal to match the night air. My wedding ring caught the streetlight, the small diamond he'd saved for months to buy, catching and throwing fragments of light across the car's dark surface. Sarah's house looked exactly like the kind of place she would choose. Tasteful, artistic, with carefully chosen plants flanking the front steps and what looked like handmade pottery holding late-season mums. A small placard by the door read S. Chen in elegant script. She'd gone back to her maiden name after her Portland divorce, Marcus had mentioned once in passing. The living room window faced the street, framed by white curtains that were drawn but not completely closed. A gap of maybe 6 inches revealed a slice of the interior, warm lamplight, the edge of a burgundy couch, part of what looked like a coffee table with wine glasses. Wine glasses, plural. I crept closer to the window, my breath coming in short, silent puffs. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was wrong, that I was violating privacy, that there were a dozen innocent explanations for what I was seeing. But my feet kept moving forward, drawn by a need to know that was stronger than my sense of propriety. Through the gap in the curtains, I could see more now. Sarah sat curled on one end of the burgundy couch, her legs tucked beneath her, wearing what looked like a cream-colored sweater that made her dark hair shine. She was laughing at something, her head tilted back in the unconscious way of someone completely comfortable and relaxed. And there, on the opposite end of the couch, close enough that their knees were almost touching, sat my husband. Marcus looked more relaxed than I'd seen him in months. His tie was loose, his jacket nowhere in sight, sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He held a wine glass in one hand and was gesturing with the other, clearly in the middle of telling some story that had Sarah's complete attention. The scene looked intimate in a way that made my chest constrict. Not necessarily romantic, not yet, but personal, private. The kind of comfortable closeness that develops between two people who have history, who understand each other's rhythms and references. The kind of ease that Marcus and I used to share before life got complicated with job stress and fertility struggles and the quiet disappointments that accumulate in a marriage.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I pressed closer to the window, my palm flat against the cool glass of the house's exterior wall. They were talking, but I couldn't make out words. Only the rise and fall of conversation, punctuated by Sarah's bright laughter and Marcus's lower chuckle. At one point, she reached over and touched his arm while making some point, and he didn't pull away. The gesture lasted maybe 3 seconds, completely casual, but it hit me like a physical blow. When was the last time I'd touched Marcus like that? Easy, unconscious, without agenda or effort. When was the last time I'd seen him laugh the way he was laughing now, completely unguarded and present? The pregnancy test in my pocket suddenly felt like an anchor, weighing me down with the reality of what this moment meant. I was carrying his child, our child, and he was here, sharing wine and easy intimacy with the woman who'd once held his heart. The woman who'd left him and was now back, professionally successful and apparently available. Sarah stood up from the couch, saying something that made Marcus grin and shake his head. She moved toward what I assumed was the kitchen, disappearing from my narrow view. Marcus leaned back against the couch cushions, and for a moment, his expression changed. The easy laughter faded, replaced by something more serious, more conflicted. He pulled out his phone, and I instinctively reached for mine, expecting it to ring. But he didn't call. Instead, he seemed to be reading something, probably my earlier voicemail, and his face grew more troubled. He set the phone on the coffee table without responding, then ran both hands through his hair in a gesture I recognized as his tell when he was wrestling with a difficult decision. Sarah returned with what looked like a bottle of wine and the kind of artisanal cheese and cracker arrangement that suggested this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment work meeting. She'd planned this. They'd planned this. The realization hit me like cold water. This wasn't Marcus working late and stopping by Sarah's house for some innocent reason. This was Marcus choosing to be here instead of home with me. As Sarah settled back onto the couch, now sitting noticeably closer to Marcus than before, I saw him glance at his phone again. My voicemail was probably still waiting, along with my text asking where he was. His pregnant wife was looking for him, and he was choosing not to respond. The wind chime above Sarah's porch gave a soft melody as a breeze stirred the night air, and I realized I was shivering, not from cold, but from the slow, creeping understanding that my marriage might be more fragile than I'd ever imagined, and I was about to become a mother in a world that suddenly felt much less stable than it had 2 hours ago. I needed to hear what they were saying. I needed to understand what was happening in that warm, intimate room before I decided what to do with the life-changing news burning in my pocket. I moved along the side of Sarah's house like a shadow, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain the neighbors could hear it. The small garden path between her house and the next was lined with decorative stones that threatened to crunch under my feet with each careful step. A motion sensor light above her side door made me freeze for 30 seconds, but it didn't activate. I was just outside its range. The kitchen window was partially open, probably to let out cooking smells from dinner. Through the gap, voices drifted into the cool night air, suddenly clear and devastatingly audible. "Can't keep doing this to her," Marcus was saying, his voice carrying that tone of tortured responsibility I knew so well. "Jessica doesn't deserve to live in limbo while I figure out what I want." My legs went weak. I pressed my back against the house's siding, the rough texture catching on my jacket. The pregnancy test crackled in my pocket as I shifted, and I had to bite my lip to keep from making a sound. "But you do know what you want." Sarah's voice was softer, gentler than I remembered from the few times I'd met her at work events. "You've known since I came back. We both have." "It's not that simple," Marcus replied. "We're married. We've been trying to have a baby. There's history, there's, Sarah interrupted, and even through the window, I could hear the smile in her voice. There's always been us, Marcus. Even when I was in Portland, even when you married her, there was always this. The silence that followed felt like it lasted hours. I could picture Marcus's face, the way his jaw tightened when he was processing something difficult, the way he'd look down at his hands and then back up with those dark eyes that had once made me feel like the only woman in the world. "I know," he said finally, so quietly I almost missed it. My knees buckled, and I slid down the wall until I was crouching in Sarah's side garden among her winter-dormant hostas. 8 years of marriage, 3 years of fertility struggles, 2 devastating miscarriages, and countless nights of holding each other through the disappointment, all of it was crumbling in real time outside this window. "The timing was all wrong before," Sarah continued. "I was 25 and terrified of commitment. You were hurt and angry, and Jessica was there to pick up the pieces. But we're different people now. We're ready for what we were too young for then." "She'll be devastated," Marcus said, and I could hear him moving around the kitchen. "She's been through so much already with the pregnancy losses. The doctors said her chances of conceiving naturally are getting slimmer each year. If I leave now? If you stay, you're guaranteeing that all 3 of us will be miserable," Sarah said firmly. "Do you think Jessica doesn't sense that part of you is somewhere else? Do you think she doesn't deserve a husband who's completely present, completely hers?" The cruelest part was that she wasn't wrong. Over the past few months, I had sensed Marcus pulling away. I'd attributed it to work stress, to our fertility struggles, to the normal ebb and flow of a long marriage. I'd never imagined it was because his first love had waltzed back into his life with perfect timing and a job that put her in his orbit every single day. "I dream about you." Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly through the open window. "Even before you came back, I dream about you. About what we could have been if I'd fought harder to keep you. If I'd followed you to Portland instead of letting pride keep me here." "I dreamed about you too," Sarah admitted. "The whole time I was married to David, I compared everything to what we had. The way you used to make me laugh, the way you'd get so intense when you were designing something, the way you kissed me like I was the only woman you'd ever want to kiss." I pressed my hand to my mouth to keep from making a sound. In my pocket, the pregnancy test felt like a cruel joke. I was carrying the child of a man who was in another woman's kitchen, confessing that he'd never stopped loving her. "What about Jessica's thing at work?" Sarah asked, and I heard the clink of wine glasses. "That promotion she's been working toward?" "She got it," Marcus said. "Found out yesterday. Senior marketing director at Morrison Industries. She's been wanting it for 2 years." I had gotten the promotion. The call had come Tuesday afternoon, and I'd been saving the news to tell Marcus over a special dinner this weekend. Another piece of joy that was now tainted by what I was learning about my marriage. "She'll be fine financially then," Sarah said, and there was something calculating in her tone that made my skin crawl. "She's stronger than you think, Marcus. Women like Jessica always land on their feet." Women like Jessica, as if I were a type, a category, easily replaced and dismissed, as if 8 years of marriage could be reduced to a character assessment that justified what they were planning. "I keep thinking about that night senior year," Marcus said, his voice growing warmer with memory. "After the architecture awards ceremony, we walked around campus until 3 in the morning, just talking about what we wanted to build, what kind of life we wanted to create. You said you wanted to design houses that felt like homes," Sarah remembered, "spaces that held love." "I still want that," Marcus said. "I want it with you." The words hit me like physical blows. I'd heard versions of this conversation in my own living room, when Marcus talked about his work, his dreams, his vision for our future. But those conversations had been about us, our home, our life together. Now I understood they'd been about someone else all along. I had to get out of there before I heard something that would destroy me completely. I couldn't leave. Despite every rational thought screaming at me to walk away, to preserve what little remained of my heart, I found myself frozen in Sarah's garden, like a witness to my own execution. The pregnancy test in my pocket felt heavier with each revelation, a constant reminder that this betrayal wasn't just about me. It was about the child growing inside me who deserved a father who wanted to be there. Do you remember what you said about timing? Sarah's voice drifted through the kitchen window, followed by the sound of footsteps moving back toward the living room. I crept along the house's perimeter, following their voices like a moth drawn to flame. That everything happens when it's supposed to, Marcus replied. Through the living room window gap, I watched him sink back onto the couch, his wine glass nearly empty. I used to think that was just something people said to make themselves feel better about missed opportunities. But now? Sarah settled beside him, close enough that her knee touched his thigh. The casual intimacy of the gesture made my stomach lurch. Now I think maybe we needed those 6 years apart. Maybe we needed to become who we are now before we could be together. Marcus set down his wine glass and turned to face her fully. You needed to get married, to learn what you didn't want. I needed to rebound with Jessica, Sarah finished, and there was no malice in her voice, just matter-of-fact assessment that somehow made it worse.
That's not fair, Marcus said, but his protest lacked conviction. I did love her. I do love her, just not the way you love me. Sarah's hand found his, their fingers interlacing with the ease of people who'd done this 1,000 times before. It's okay to say it, Marcus. It doesn't make you a monster. It makes you human. I watched my husband's shoulders sag with relief, as if he'd been carrying a burden for years and someone had finally given him permission to set it down. The man I'd married, the man I'd built a life with, the man whose child was growing inside me, looked more at peace in this moment than I'd seen him in months. I felt so guilty when you came back, Marcus continued. That first day you walked into the office, I thought I was seeing a ghost. You looked exactly the same, but somehow more beautiful, more confident, and I realized that everything I thought I'd gotten over was still right there, just waiting. I knew the moment I saw you, Sarah admitted. David and I had been having problems for months, but seeing you made me realize I'd never gotten over you either. I'd just gotten better at pretending. The casual mention of her marriage ending made pieces click into place. Sarah's return to Portland hadn't been just a career move. It had been an escape from her own failed relationship. And she'd landed directly in my husband's path at the exact moment when our marriage was most vulnerable. When did you know? Marcus asked. When did you know for sure that we still had something? Sarah was quiet for a moment, and I watched her trace patterns on Marcus's palm with her finger. Remember the Morrison Hotel site visit last month, when we got caught in that rainstorm and had to wait it out in your car? Marcus nodded, and I remembered that day clearly. He'd come home soaked and laughing, telling me about getting drenched while reviewing blueprints with a colleague. He'd been more animated that evening than he'd been in weeks, and I'd been happy to see him excited about work again. We were sitting in your car, both dripping wet, and you started laughing about how we always seem to get caught in the rain together, Sarah continued. And you looked at me with that same expression you used to have in college, like I was this amazing puzzle you couldn't wait to solve. That's when I knew nothing had really changed between us. I almost kissed you that day, Marcus confessed, his voice so low I had to strain to hear it. I know, I wanted you to. Why didn't you say something sooner? Because you're married, Sarah said simply. Because despite what I felt, despite what I could see in your eyes every time you looked at me, you were committed to someone else. I respected that, even if it was killing me. What changed? Marcus asked. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and I watched her pull her hand away from his, wrapping her arms around her knees. Last week, when you told me about Jessica's latest appointment with the fertility specialist, the way your face just shut down when you talked about trying again, about more procedures, more disappointment. You looked trapped, Marcus, like you were drowning but too honorable to swim to shore. My throat constricted. Marcus had been unusually quiet after my last appointment with Dr. Rodriguez, where we'd discussed more aggressive treatment options. I'd assumed he was processing the information, maybe worried about the financial strain. I'd never imagined he was questioning whether he wanted to have children with me at all. She deserves better than that, Sarah continued. She deserves someone who lights up at the thought of building a family with her, not someone who sees it as an obligation to fulfill. And what do I deserve? Marcus asked, and there was something raw and desperate in his voice that I'd never heard before.
You deserve to be happy, Sarah said firmly. You deserve love that doesn't feel like work. You deserve to wake up excited about your life instead of going through the motions of what you think you should want. Marcus stood up abruptly and walked to Sarah's fireplace, his back to her. I could see his reflection in her mantel mirror, and his expression was tortured with guilt and longing. I'm 34 years old, he said. I've been married for 8 years to a good woman who's never done anything wrong except fall in love with someone who wasn't completely available. How do I destroy her life because I'm finally ready to fight for what I should have fought for years ago? You don't destroy her life, Sarah quietly. You set her free to find someone who can love her the way she deserves, the way you love me. The conversation inside had grown quieter, more intimate, and I found myself holding my breath to catch every devastating word. Through the living room window, I watched Marcus turn away from the fireplace and walk back to Sarah, but instead of sitting on the couch, he knelt on the floor beside her, taking both her hands in his. I need to tell you something, he said, his voice thick with emotion, something I've never told anyone, not even Jessica. My entire body went cold. Whatever was coming next would be the final blow, the revelation that would shatter whatever remained of my illusions about our marriage. The night before I proposed to Jessica, Marcus began, I drove to the airport. I had a ticket to Portland in my glove compartment. I was going to show up at your apartment and tell you I'd made the biggest mistake of my life letting you go. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth. Marcus, you never. I sat in that parking garage for 3 hours, he continued. I had the boarding pass in my hand, and I kept starting the car, then turning it off, starting it, turning it off. I knew if I got on that plane, if I saw you, I'd never come back. The memory hit me like a physical blow. The night before Marcus proposed, he'd been distant and strange. He'd said he needed to drive around and think, that he'd be back late. When he'd returned after midnight, I'd been asleep, but I'd woken up briefly when he'd slipped into bed. He'd held me so tightly it had almost hurt, whispering, "I love you," over and over into my hair like a prayer or an apology. The next evening, he'd proposed in the rain. I'd thought the urgency in his voice, the desperate way he'd kissed me after I said yes, was passion. Now I understood it was guilt. "What stopped you?" Sarah asked, tears visible on her cheeks, even from my hidden vantage point. I kept thinking about Jessica waiting at home. She'd made dinner, had candles lit, was probably planning to tell me about some presentation at work or some funny story from her day. She trusted me completely, loved me without conditions or complications, and I was about to destroy that because I was too cowardly to let you go properly the first time. "So you proposed instead," Sarah said, understanding flooding her voice. "I proposed because I thought if I made a big enough commitment, if I promised her everything publicly and legally, I could force myself to stop loving you. I thought I could will myself into being the husband she deserved." The cruelty of it took my breath away. My entire engagement, our wedding, our 8 years of marriage, all of it built on Marcus's attempt to convince himself he could love me enough to forget someone else. I'd been an unwilling participant in his emotional therapy, a placeholder while he worked through his unfinished business. Did it work? Sarah's voice was barely audible. Marcus shook his head, his eyes never leaving her face. For a while, I thought it did. The first couple years were good. Jessica was so happy, so grateful for our life together. She made everything easy and comfortable. I told myself that was enough, that mature love was supposed to be peaceful instead of passionate. "But," Sarah prompted gently, "but then you started showing up in my dreams again, really vivid dreams where we were together, where we'd never broken up. I'd wake up next to Jessica feeling like I was living in the wrong life, like I was an actor who'd gotten stuck playing a role I'd never auditioned for." I watched Sarah lean forward and cup Marcus's face in her hands, her thumbs wiping away tears I hadn't even realized he was shedding. "The guilt was eating me alive," Marcus continued. "Every anniversary, every Valentine's Day, every time Jessica would look at me with those trusting eyes and tell me how lucky she felt to be married to me. I wanted to confess everything, but how do you tell someone that your entire marriage is built on your inability to get over someone else? You don't, Sarah whispered. You protect them from that pain for as long as you can. Until now, Marcus said, his voice breaking. Until you came back and made it impossible to pretend anymore. They were both crying now, holding each other with the desperate intensity of people who'd found their way back after being lost for too long. I watched my husband bury his face in Sarah's neck, his shoulders shaking with the release of 8 years of suppressed emotion. I love you, he whispered against her skin. I've loved you every single day for 10 years, and I'm so tired of pretending I don't. I love you too, Sarah replied, her fingers threading through his hair. They held each other in Sarah's living room like survivors of some terrible disaster, and I understood with crystalline clarity that I was the disaster. My marriage, my love, my entire life with Marcus. I was the obstacle they'd finally decided to overcome. The pregnancy test in my pocket crackled as I stood up on shaking legs. I had heard enough. I stumbled away from Sarah's house in a daze, my legs carrying me automatically toward my car, while my mind reeled with the implications of what I'd just witnessed. Every step felt surreal, as if I were moving through thick water or living someone else's nightmare. The pregnancy test bounced against my hip with each movement, a constant reminder of the impossible situation I now faced. Sitting in my car 3 blocks away, I stared at my hands gripping the steering wheel and tried to process the magnitude of what I'd learned. My entire marriage, every moment I'd treasured, every memory I'd held sacred, needed to be examined through this new, devastating lens. Our first meeting. I'd been 26, working as a junior marketing coordinator at Morrison Industries, grabbing coffee at the little cafe near our office building. Marcus had been in line behind me, and when I'd dropped my wallet trying to juggle my purse and portfolio, he'd helped me gather the scattered contents. "Rough morning?" he'd asked with that easy smile that had made my heart skip. I thought it was serendipity, fate, bringing 2 people together at exactly the right moment. Now I understood the timeline differently. Sarah had left him just 6 months earlier. I hadn't been the beginning of his love story. I'd been his rebound relationship that accidentally became permanent. Our early dating months suddenly took on a different quality in my memory. Marcus had been intense, almost desperate in his attention. He'd called every day, planned elaborate dates, introduced me to his friends within weeks of meeting. I'd been swept off my feet by what I'd interpreted as romantic devotion. But desperate men cling to life rafts, and that's what I'd been. His way of staying afloat after Sarah had left him drowning. The proposal. God, the proposal. Every detail that had once seemed romantic now felt tainted with his confession. He'd been planning to chase after Sarah the night before he asked me to marry him. The rain, the urgency in his voice, the way he'd held me afterward like he was afraid I might disappear, it all made horrible sense now. He hadn't been proposing out of overwhelming love. He'd been proposing out of overwhelming guilt. Our wedding day rushed back to me in vivid, painful clarity. Marcus had been nervous, which I'd attributed to normal groom jitters. But I remembered now how he'd stepped outside the church before the ceremony, how his best man Jake had found him sitting on the steps with his head in his hands. "Just needed some air," Marcus had said when I'd asked him about it later. "Big day, you know." During our first dance, he'd whispered, "I promise I'll spend every day trying to deserve you." I'd melted at what I thought was romantic devotion. Now I heard it as the pledge of a man trying to convince himself he could be the husband I needed him to be. The early years of our marriage had been good, or so I thought. Marcus had been attentive, considerate, always remembering anniversaries and birthdays, but there had been moments, small things that had nagged at me without understanding why. The way he'd go quiet when songs from the early 2000s played on the radio, how he'd sometimes stare out windows with an expression I couldn't read, the careful way he'd avoided talking about his college years beyond surface-level stories. I'd attributed his occasional distance to his architectural mind, always designing and redesigning in his head. "You're so creative," I'd say when I'd catch him lost in thought, "always building something in your imagination." He'd smile and pull me close, but now I wondered if he'd been building a different life entirely, one where he'd made different choices. The fertility struggles took on new meaning too. We'd started trying for children 3 years ago, and when nothing happened naturally, Marcus had been supportive through all the appointments and procedures. But I remembered his face during Dr. Rodriguez's explanations about treatment options, how he'd grown increasingly quiet as the processes became more invasive and expensive. "Maybe we should take a break," he'd suggested after my second miscarriage. "Give your body time to recover, give us time to just be together without the pressure." I thought he was being considerate of my emotional state. Now I wondered if he'd been relieved to postpone binding himself more permanently to a life he'd never fully chosen. Every "I love you" he'd ever said to me played back in my memory with new context. Had he meant it? Could someone love two people simultaneously? Or had he been loving me as much as he was capable while reserving the deepest parts of himself for someone else? The photo on my phone's lock screen showed Marcus and me from our last anniversary dinner 2 months ago. We looked happy, or at least I looked happy. But studying Marcus's expression now, I could see something I'd missed before, a subtle distance in his eyes, as if part of him wasn't entirely present for the moment we were supposed to be celebrating. How many times had he looked at me and seen someone else? How many times had he held me while wishing I was Sarah? I drove home on autopilot, my mind surprisingly clear despite the emotional devastation I'd just witnessed. The pregnancy test sat in my lap now, removed from my pocket, its plastic case catching the streetlight as I pulled into our driveway. Our house looked exactly as I'd left it 3 hours ago, porch light on, kitchen window glowing warmly, but I was returning as a completely different person than the one who'd left with takeout containers and joyful news to share. Inside, everything felt like a museum of someone else's life. The wedding photos on the mantle, the vacation souvenirs, the carefully chosen furniture we'd picked out together, all of it now felt like props in an elaborate performance that I'd been the only one taking seriously. I sat at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten breakfast that morning, while Marcus scrolled through his phone and I'd chattered about weekend plans. Had he been thinking about Sarah then? Had he been planning tonight's visit while I'd talked about maybe trying that new farmer's market downtown? The strategic part of my mind, the part that had earned me the promotion Marcus didn't even know I cared about anymore, began calculating my options with surgical precision. I could confront him when he came home, screaming and crying and demanding explanations that would only force him to lie more elaborately. I could pretend I'd never discovered his betrayal, living the rest of my life as a woman married to someone else's ghost. Or I could take control of my own narrative. I pulled out my laptop and began typing, my fingers steady despite the tremor in my hands. The email went to my lawyer, Patricia Chen. No relation to Sarah, just an unfortunate coincidence of common surnames that felt like salt in an open wound. "Patricia, I need to schedule an appointment as soon as possible to discuss divorce proceedings. The situation is time-sensitive for reasons I'll explain when we meet. Can you see me tomorrow morning? Amanda." Amanda. My name felt foreign to me now, as if I'd been playing the role of Marcus's wife for so long that I'd forgotten who I was underneath the performance. But Amanda was who I'd been before Marcus found me in that coffee shop 8 years ago, and Amanda was who I'd need to be again. The response came back within minutes. Patricia was notorious for working late and checking email at all hours. "Amanda, of course, 9 a.m. tomorrow, whatever you need. P." Next, I called my sister Lauren in Seattle. It was after midnight, but Lauren had always been a night owl, and I needed to hear a familiar voice that wasn't connected to the wreckage of my life in Portland. "Amanda, what's wrong?" Lauren's voice was instantly alert, the way it had been since we were children, and she'd appointed herself my protector, despite being only 18 months older. "I need a favor," I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. "Can you book me a flight to Seattle for tomorrow night? One way, flexible return." What happened? Lauren's protective instincts were clearly firing on all cylinders. Marcus is having an affair, I'm pregnant, and I need to get out of here before I do something I'll regret. The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds before Lauren's voice came back, sharp with anger on my behalf. "What do you need me to do?" We spent 20 minutes coordinating logistics. Lauren would book the flight, prepare her guest room, and clear her weekend schedule. She didn't ask for details. She'll get the full story when I was ready to tell it, but her immediate, unconditional support reminded me that I wasn't as alone as Marcus's betrayal had made me feel. The pregnancy test sat on the kitchen counter as I made my final preparations. Tomorrow, I'd be gone before Marcus even realized what was happening. But tonight, I had one last thing to do. I found our wedding album in the living room bookshelf, its white leather cover pristine despite 8 years of marriage. Flipping through the pages, I located my favorite photo from our reception. Marcus and me during our first dance, my dress spread around us like flower petals, both of us laughing at something his uncle had shouted from the audience. I carefully removed the photo from its plastic sleeve and placed it on the kitchen table next to the pregnancy test. Then, I began writing on the back of our wedding invitation, which had been tucked behind the photo as a keepsake.
Marcus, I wrote in my careful handwriting, by the time you read this, you'll be free to be with the person you've always really wanted to be with. The baby and I will be fine without you. Thank you for 8 years of teaching me the difference between being loved and being settled for. I hope you and Sarah are very happy together. Amanda. I set the pen down and looked at the scene I'd created. Pregnancy test, wedding photo, and farewell note arranged like artifacts from a life that was ending. It looked almost artistic in its devastating simplicity. Marcus would be home soon, probably full of guilt and elaborate explanations about where he'd been tonight. He'd find this tableau instead of the celebration he'd never intended to have anyway. My suitcase was already packed and waiting by the front door. All that remained was to walk away from the life I'd built with a man who'd never been entirely mine to begin with. I sat in Lauren's guest room in Seattle, staring at my phone as it buzzed incessantly on the nightstand. 17 missed calls from Marcus, 12 voicemails, and a stream of text messages that had evolved from confusion to panic to desperate pleading over the past 6 hours. I'd turned off the sound after the first few calls, but the screen continued lighting up like a strobe light in the dim room. Lauren had picked me up at SeaTac without asking a single question about my red eyes or the way I'd collapsed into her arms at the baggage claim. She'd driven me to her Capitol Hill apartment, made chamomile tea, and simply waited while I stared at the city lights through her kitchen window. When I'd finally told her everything, Sarah, the overheard conversation, the 8-year lie my marriage had been built on, she'd listened without judgment, only occasionally muttering creative curse words under her breath. "You can stay as long as you need," she said. "Forever, if that's what it takes." Now at 3 a.m., I finally looked at Marcus's messages. The progression told a story of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. 11:47 p.m. Amanda, I'm home. Where are you? Your car's here, but you're not. Call me. 12:23 a.m. I found your note. Please call me. We need to talk about this. 12:45 a.m. Amanda, please, I know how this looks, but you don't understand the whole situation. Just call me back. 1:15 a.m. I've been calling everyone we know. Lauren won't answer her phone. Your mom hasn't heard from you. I'm going crazy here. Are you safe? 1:52 a.m. I know you heard us tonight, didn't you? You were at Sarah's house. God, Amanda, I'm so sorry. This isn't how you were supposed to find out. 2:34 a.m. I'm sitting here looking at the pregnancy test and I can't breathe. We're having a baby. We're having a baby. Please don't take that away from me. Please don't take yourself away from me. The last message had come through just 10 minutes ago. I love you. I know you don't believe that right now, but I love you. I've always loved you. What you heard tonight, it's complicated. Please come home so I can explain. I set the phone aside and walked to Lauren's bathroom, studying my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me had hollow eyes and pale skin, but there was something else there too, a clarity I hadn't seen in years. For the first time in my marriage, I knew exactly where I stood.
Not on shifting sand, not in some liminal space between being wanted and being settled for, but on solid ground of my own choosing. My phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Marcus. "Amanda, it's Sarah. Marcus gave me your number. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need you to know that I never meant for this to happen the way it did. Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a long moment. The woman who'd been my husband's secret obsession for 10 years wanted to talk to me? The woman whose existence had turned my marriage into an elaborate lie wanted to explain herself. The audacity was almost impressive. I typed back, "There's nothing to talk about. You won. Enjoy your prize." Her response came immediately. "It's not like that. You don't understand what really happened between Marcus and me tonight." My hands shook as I typed. "I understand perfectly. I heard every word." "You heard part of it. You left before." I turned off my phone. Lauren appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of tea, her dark hair tousled from sleep she hadn't been getting either. "The vultures circling?" she asked, nodding toward my silent phone. "Marcus and now Sarah. She wants to explain what I overheard." Lauren made a sound of disgust that would have made our mother scold her for being unladylike. What could she possibly have to explain? That she's been systematically dismantling your marriage while pretending to be professional colleagues? That she manipulated a vulnerable man who was too cowardly to end his marriage honestly? "Maybe she wants to tell me about their beautiful love story," I said bitterly. "How they're soulmates who were just waiting for the right time to be together. How I was just keeping Marcus's side of the bed warm until she was ready to come back and claim him." "Or maybe she feels guilty and wants your forgiveness so she can sleep better at night," Lauren suggested. "Some people need absolution from their victims to feel good about their choices." I took a sip of tea and felt its warmth spread through my chest. For the first time in hours, I felt almost human again. "I'm not giving her that," I said quietly. "I'm not giving either of them that." Lauren smiled, and it was fierce and proud. "Good. Let them figure out how to live with what they've done. You focus on figuring out how to live without them." Marcus arrived at Lauren's apartment at 7 a.m. on Saturday morning, looking like he hadn't slept in days. I watched from the living room window as he sat in his rental car for 10 minutes, running his hands through his hair and staring at the building like it might provide answers he didn't want to face. When Lauren's buzzer rang, I nodded to her. "Let him up, but stay close." "Are you sure?" she asked, her hand hovering over the intercom button. "I need to look him in the eye when he tries to explain this away." Marcus appeared at Lauren's door looking hollow and desperate, his usual put-together appearance replaced by wrinkled clothes and bloodshot eyes. He'd flown to Seattle on the first available flight, probably spending the entire trip crafting the speech he thought would save our marriage. "Amanda." His voice cracked saying my name. "Thank God you're okay." "I'm fine," I said, not moving from my position on Lauren's couch, though I'm sure that's disappointing. He winced at the coldness in my tone, but stepped into the apartment, his eyes immediately going to my still flat stomach. "The baby?" "Is fine too. No thanks to you." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, tears were threatening to spill over. "I know how this looks. I know what you think you heard, but I think I heard my husband confessing his love to another woman. I think I heard him admitting that our entire marriage was his attempt to get over someone else. I think I heard him planning to leave me. Did I mishear something?" The silence stretched between us while Marcus struggled to find words that could minimize 8 years of deception. "You didn't mishear," he said finally. "But you didn't hear everything either. After you left—" "After I left? What? You realized you actually do love me? You decided Sarah wasn't worth destroying our family for? You remembered that I'm pregnant with your child?" "After you left, I told Sarah I couldn't do it." Marcus took a step closer, his voice growing more urgent. "I told her that no matter what I felt for her, I couldn't destroy you. I couldn't destroy our marriage, our baby, everything we've built together." I studied his face, looking for the lie I was certain was there. And what did she say to that? Marcus's jaw tightened. She said I was a coward, that I was condemning all three of us to lives of quiet misery because I was too afraid to choose what I really wanted. She wasn't wrong, I said quietly. Amanda, please. Marcus knelt beside Lauren's couch, his hands reaching for mine before stopping when I pulled away. I know I've made terrible mistakes. I know I should have been honest with you years ago about my feelings for Sarah, but I stayed. I chose you. I choose you now. You chose me by default, I corrected. You chose me because I was safe, because I made your life comfortable, because leaving would have been messy and difficult. That's not the same thing as wanting me. That's not true. Isn't it? I stood up, pacing to Lauren's window. Tell me honestly, Marcus. If Sarah had never left Portland, if she'd been available when we met, would you have given me a second glance? The pause before his answer told me everything I needed to know. Marcus's silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know, he admitted. I can't answer that honestly because I'll never know who I would have been if things had been different. The honesty was somehow worse than if he'd lied. At least a lie would have given me something to be angry about, something to fight against. This quiet acknowledgement of my fears felt like watching him sign our marriage's death certificate. But I can tell you who I am now, Marcus continued, standing up from where he'd been kneeling. I'm a man who spent 8 years building a life with an incredible woman. I'm someone who's about to become a father with the person I've shared more honest moments with than anyone else in my life. Honest moments? I turned from the window to face him fully. Marcus, you just admitted you've been carrying a torch for another woman our entire marriage? How is any of that honest? Because everything else was real, he said desperately. Every morning I made you coffee, every time I held you when you cried about the miscarriages, every time we laughed until we couldn't breathe watching terrible movies, that was real. That was me choosing you every single day, even when part of me was somewhere else. I felt Lauren shift in the kitchen doorway, where she'd been pretending to give us privacy while clearly listening to every word. Her presence reminded me that I wasn't alone in this, that I had people who loved me without conditions or complications. That's not enough anymore, I said, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff. I can't spend the rest of my life wondering if you're thinking about her when you look at me. I can't raise our child in a house where mommy is daddy's consolation prize. Amanda, you were never a consolation prize. Yes, I was. The clarity of it was almost peaceful. I was the woman you settled for because the woman you wanted wasn't available. And now she is available, and you're here trying to convince both of us that duty is the same thing as love. Marcus sank onto Lauren's couch, his head in his hands. So what happens now? You divorce me? You raise our child alone? You punish all three of us because I was stupid and selfish at 26? I'm not punishing anyone, I said, sitting across from him. I'm setting us free. You're free to be with Sarah without guilt or obligation. I'm free to find someone who chooses me first, not last. And our child will be free from growing up in a house full of resentment and quiet disappointment. I don't want to be free from you, Marcus said, looking up with red-rimmed eyes. I want to fix this. I want to be the husband you deserve. You can't become someone different just because you want to, I replied gently. And I can't become someone who's okay with being second choice. We are who we are, Marcus. Finally admitting that isn't failure. It's mercy. He nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his expression that this wasn't a fight he could win with the right words or promises. This was the end of something that had been ending slowly for years. I'll take care of you, he said finally. Both of you. Whatever you need. I know you will. You're a good man, Marcus. You're just not my man. The divorce papers were filed 3 weeks later, on a gray November morning that matched my mood perfectly. Patricia had been thorough and efficient, ensuring that my financial security and the baby's future were protected, while keeping the proceedings as civil as possible. Marcus hadn't contested anything. Not the asset division, not my request for primary custody, not even my decision to keep my maiden name for the baby. "He's being remarkably cooperative," Patricia noted during our final meeting. "Most men in his situation put up more of a fight." "He knows he doesn't have moral high ground to stand on," I replied, signing the last of the documents. "And honestly, I think part of him is relieved that someone else made the hard choice for him." I'd moved back to Portland the week before, but not to our old house. Instead, I'd found a small 2-bedroom apartment in the Pearl District, close enough to downtown for work, but far enough from our old neighborhood to avoid accidental encounters. Lauren had helped me pack, only the things that felt purely mine: my books, my clothes, the artwork I bought before I was half of a couple. Everything else stayed with Marcus, relics of a shared life that no longer existed. The pregnancy was progressing normally, though my morning sickness seemed amplified by stress. Dr. Rodriguez had referred me to a new practice closer to my apartment, where I attended appointments alone and filled out forms listing single as my marital status. The intake nurse had looked sympathetic when I'd explained my situation, but I was surprised to find I didn't feel embarrassed or ashamed. I felt liberated. Work had become my sanctuary. The promotion Marcus had mentioned to Sarah came with new responsibilities that kept my mind occupied during the day and left me exhausted enough to sleep at night. My colleagues had noticed my wedding ring's absence, but were too professional to ask direct questions, though I caught a few concerned glances when I'd started showing around my 14th week. Marcus had tried to call several times in the first few days after Seattle, but I'd let them all go to voicemail. His messages had evolved from desperate pleas to sad acceptance to practical questions about doctor appointments and legal logistics. I'd responded to the practical ones via text, keeping our communications strictly functional.
Sarah had reached out twice more, once through a carefully worded email asking if we could meet for closure, and once through a mutual acquaintance at work who'd clearly been recruited to play intermediary. I'd ignored both attempts. Whatever guilt or validation she needed from me wasn't my responsibility to provide. The most unexpected consequence had been my relationship with Marcus's mother, Elena. She'd called 2 weeks after I'd filed the papers, her voice thick with tears and confusion. "I don't understand what happened," she'd said. "Marcus won't give me details, just says you've grown apart. But you're having our grandchild. How can you grow apart when you're creating life together?" I'd found myself explaining more to Elena than I'd planned, watching her process the reality that her son had been emotionally unavailable throughout our marriage. By the end of the conversation, she was crying for me rather than trying to convince me to reconcile. "You deserve better than that, mija," she'd said, using the Spanish endearment she'd called me since our wedding day. "The baby deserves better too." Her support had meant more than I'd expected. 6 months later, I stood in the nursery of my Pearl District apartment, hanging the last mobile above the crib I'd assembled myself with help from Lauren and Alina, who'd become an unexpected ally in my new life. The room was painted a soft sage green, nothing like the yellow nursery that had sat empty in the house I'd shared with Marcus. This space was entirely mine, created for the daughter I'd carry and raise on my own terms. At 28 weeks pregnant, I'd found a rhythm that surprised me with its contentment. Work was fulfilling in ways it had never been when I'd been splitting my energy between career ambitions and trying to decode my husband's emotional availability. My body was changing in miraculous ways that I got to experience without the complicated overlay of a failing marriage. I talked to my daughter constantly, telling her about the life we'd build together, the strength she was already teaching me to find. Marcus and I had settled into a cordial co-parenting arrangement that existed entirely through our lawyers and a shared digital calendar. He'd agreed to supervised visits until the baby was older, acknowledging that his emotional chaos wasn't something a newborn needed to navigate. The child support was generous, though I'd made it clear I didn't need his money to provide a good life for our daughter. I'd heard through Elena that Marcus and Sarah were officially together now, living in the house that used to be ours.
They'd moved in together 2 months after our divorce was finalized, apparently having decided that their great love story could begin in earnest once the inconvenient obstacle of his marriage had been cleared away. Elena's reports were neutral but pointed. They seemed happy, but Sarah had already started redecorating everything I'd chosen, and Marcus appeared thinner and more stressed than he'd been during our marriage. Guilt is heavy to carry, Elena had observed during one of our monthly coffee dates, even when you get what you think you want. I'd found myself feeling something unexpected toward both of them. Not quite forgiveness, but a kind of detached understanding. They were getting exactly what they wanted, and learning that getting what you want isn't the same as being happy. Meanwhile, I was discovering that losing what I'd thought I wanted was actually the beginning of finding what I needed. My daughter kicked against my ribs as I adjusted the mobile, and I placed my hand over the spot, feeling her strong movements. "Your daddy isn't a bad man, little one," I said softly, something I'd promised myself I'd never poison her against the father she'd know only on weekends and holidays. He just wasn't the right man for us, but that's okay, because we're going to be just fine on our own. The afternoon sun streamed through the nursery windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny stars in the golden light. For the first time in years, I felt completely present in my own life, no longer performing the role of someone else's wife or trying to be enough for someone who'd never been fully available to be enough for me in return. I was exactly where I belonged, building exactly the life I was meant to live, with exactly the family I was meant to have. Sometimes the most devastating endings are actually the most merciful beginnings.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.